Hi guys, welcome back to Wherever You Made, and today we're taking off from where we left off in the last video, where we ruined this tabletop and revealed all the air pockets and stuff in them. So what my plan is we're going to rip it down so it's not as wide, because we're going to turn this into a coffee table instead and salvage what we can out of this project. So took my little track saw, squared everything up, cut the base off because I wanted to flip that 90 degrees and have a sort of waterfall effect. But you can see this wood is very warped because it's just been sat in my shed unprotected, with one side being painted and the other side not, so the humidity has bent it. So I clamped it and I got a straight edge to sort of clamp it all in place and try get it as flat as possible while doing that. And as I was doing that, this corner ripped out. This wood, it's very, very unstable, and well, hence the title Unusable. So this just kept happening and kept happening. So I decided to grab a spare bit of wood I had from this and just cut a bit off and wedge it in there as an inlay. Wasn't the best inlay I've ever done, but it did the job. And with this wood, it didn't matter how sharp my chisel was, the wood just preferred to fold over rather than cut. I mean, the majority of the table is solid. Like, I can't, press my finger into it and it's all rotten. But the wood is very brittle. So, yeah. I feel like that's a bit misleading. I got all the rotten pieces out in my last video that I showed you. I chipped all the rotten pieces out, but the rest of the wood, it's just really old wood. And, it's seen some stuff in its time being a scaffolding board. So, it's just not stable. It easily chips and it's very annoying to work with. But anyway, we got everything all chiseled out and all cut up, and I'm ready to go ahead and inlay it now. This inlay was a bit odd because it wasn't just like cutting it straight out and then putting it right down. One of the angles was a 45-degree angle, so I kind of had to cut the receiving end bigger and wedge it down in there and use that 45-degree angle I cut to push it into the back of it. Managed to get it working. Had to get creative with my clamping, chuck some sawdust around it for good measure, and left it to dry. And then I came back through with a dull saw and cut everything off so it was relatively flat, and then came back over with a belt sander just to flatten it all down. You want to be careful with these belt sanders, by the way, doing things like this, because it just eats material like it's nothing. And for the love of God, don't do what I'm going to do in this next clip. If I had any kickback here, I could have got a circular saw blade to the chest. I could have easily cut a finger off. I knew this was sketchy at the time, and I wish I didn't do it, but it got the job done and it did it. But please, please, please do not do this. You see here I'm making light of it at the time, but watching it back I can really see how you can really hurt yourself doing something like that. So be careful when using these kind of tools, because they can very easily take a finger and they will not feel guilty about it. But anyway, after I got everything cut up, squared up and all sorted, I moved on to the old legs. Didn't like them, so I decided to cut them all down, make them a lot smaller for this coffee table, so I can have one side with box legs and then the other side with the waterfall sort of design. And had to sort of work around all the holes that I drilled into the legs, but I just filled them in with some wood filler. You'll see that later on in the video. And measure twice, cut once. I measured from the top of the table instead of the bottom of the table, so easy mistake to make, but we'll go back, we'll measure it upright, and we'll actually cut it the right size this time. You can see there I'm using a razor blade to scribe it, trying to be a bit more accurate, but it probably doesn't matter for something like this. Then after I did that, I squared all the boards up again, even though they're already relatively square, but it's nicer just to be extra sure that everything's nice and solid together. And I'm not actually going to use screws to put these legs together like I usually do. I'm going to try be a bit more of a woodworker, just because I've got this nifty new kit to cut plugs. So I marked everything out so everything lines up correctly. I got my nifty new plug cutter, got into an old pallet block and just started cutting loads of plugs out. You can see how easy it is just to make a bunch of plugs at once. These plug cutters, they're made with a very, very, very shallow taper to them because you are meant to use them to like plug up holes. So the harder you knock them down, obviously the wider the taper gets and the more snug it fits in the hole you drill in. But the taper is so minimal that you can use them as plugs as well. It's only for alignment really while you're gluing everything up. So this worked perfectly well for me. Just put them over and yeah, everything was lined up and ready. And it made me feel better knowing that there's not any nail holes or screw holes I have to fill up, even though I did have to use wood filler in this project to cover the holes I previously made. It was just felt a lot nicer doing this, and everything came out nice and square off the bat, so I wasn't battling any screw holes or anything like that. Didn't have to worry about poking out any of the sides. It was just a breeze using these. So as you saw with how the table was a bit warped and bent, I decided to get a straight edge, run it along the top of the table to see where the high points were. I got a pencil, made sure that I marked all the high points so I can come back with a belt sander and get them all down. When I say this took forever, it took forever. Realistically, I should have just set up a router sled to do this, and I would have done it in a couple of passes. But because I did that in the last video, I was a little bit scared, and I didn't want to encounter any pocket holes. Not pocket holes, what do you call them? Air holes in the middle of it. Even though I was just as likely to break through any air holes in here, but I went through and I just used the sander anyway. But it took forever. I used up so many belts, and it was just a headache. But here's a little preview of what the table is going to look like. I think it looks very sleek and nice, especially once we get it all stained and stuff. But we do still have issues like all the chip out and stuff we had. So I decided I'm going to try make some veneer to put over the top. I just got some old boards that I had, and I cut very thin strips out of them and basically just glued them onto the side. And here's me just cutting them a little bit thinner so it doesn't look as noticeable when you look from the top going down. And you see me using a pencil there as a push rod because these were so thin and I don't have very much experience making veneer. But I wouldn't even know if you'd call this a veneer because these were still like 3 or so millimeters thick, and veneer is only like a millimeter or so, isn't it? So yeah, using the last of the glue in my bottle, and I'm just getting as many clamps on as possible. It's a lot harder trying to glue this sort of stuff on because with normal bigger blocks of wood, you don't have to use as many clamps, but this stuff likes to bend, so you need as many clamps on there as possible, or else, because they only really pinch in where you've got the clamps on, so in between all the clamp holes, it's just not pushing too, if you know what I mean. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but you sort of get the gist anyway. But cut some 45 degrees in there to make it look a lot nicer and fancy, because the 45-degree cuts that I made previously on this board were absolutely appalling. And remember to drop your freshly glued strip onto your dusty workbench, so you have to wipe everything off and put the glue back on. It's the little things, isn't it, that annoy you, that ruin your day. So quickly wiped everything back off and scraped it, and just reapplied the glue so it would be able to actually sit flush instead of being covered in chips and sawdust. But whacked as many clamps on there as possible. I think looking back, what I should have done is I should have got some thicker blocks and actually used them so it would make it more seamless. There wasn't really any gaps anyway, but it would have made it a lot easier. But I left these a little bit proud everywhere so I could come back with a plane and a chisel and make them flush with the table. It was just an easier way of doing it than cutting them to the exact size and putting them on there. Try getting some nice live action shots, but it didn't come out as well as I wanted to, but I chuck it in there anyway. Then I just went ahead and sanded everything, made sure everything looked nice, get rid of all the chip out that's on it, using that flat reference just to make sure everything's coming out flat, and if there's any high spots that show up, I'll just quickly go back and hit them with the sander. Did the same thing to the side here as well. It was moving everywhere, so I had to clamp it down. And if you have a keen eye, you can see the kitchen island build that I'm standing on the floor because this project is that old and it's taken me that long. So yeah, and my workshop doesn't even look like this now. I've insulated the workshop and I've got some pallet wood all nailed up. You'll see it in upcoming videos. It's still not completely done yet, but my shed looks a lot more different to this now. Even the layout, I've moved everything around. But here you can see with the veneer on the side, it looks a lot more nicer and cleaner. So I'm happy I went with the veneer. Still doesn't look amazing. The 45 degree doesn't line up that well, but it's better than it was before. Then I just went over with a round over bit and just rounded over everything to give it a little bit of a better look. But I couldn't get into these corners, so I just had to come back with a chisel and just round everything out. I was going to use some files to get in there, but it turns out it was a lot easier just to do everything with the chisel and just carve it, so that's what I ended up doing. These tiny little files I used to use when I was a mechanical apprentice. They're really good for getting into nice small spaces, but they're painfully slow to use with wood, so I don't think I'll be using them for wood on a project again. But I went ahead and just mixed up a very, very small batch of epoxy. Because this has been sanded down so much, there's been tiny little air gaps and air holes and bubbles and stuff left in some of the cracks. So what I did is I got some of these picks. I'll put a link to them down in the description below. They're very cheap, and if you do a lot of epoxy pours or little tiny bits of work, they're really good to use to get in there and push the epoxy down in the holes. Because when you try to put epoxy over a very, very small air bubble, it doesn't want to seep down because of the water tension, I guess you'd call it, in the epoxy. So you get a needle and you stick it in there to break that gap. But these little like dental picks are really, really handy to use. You can see there I'm just pushing the epoxy into all the cracks and gaps that have arose. And even this was a very long and drawn out process. I actually went and did this a couple of times. I didn't record the majority of it because, well, you don't want to sit here and see me do the same thing for 10 minutes, do you? But after I did all of that, I went back and sanded everything flush again and made sure everything was looking nice. One thing I didn't notice now though is the epoxy seems to have seeped in and made it look a lot more fuzzy rather than sharp, which I don't understand because I'm using pigment, so the pigment shouldn't get soaked into the wood. But I guess it just shows you how unusable this wood is. It's very porous and it's very old and dry, so it must have just soaked up the pigment as well. It didn't leave quite as nice a look. And here's me not learning from my mistakes, and I'm using wood sheen again, the finish that I couldn't get right on the table before. And this time I tried using ebony, and straight away I hated it. I didn't even wait for it to dry. I was just looking at it, and there was not a single part of me that just thought, yes, that looks nice. The epoxy, the cracks and stuff that were in it that I thought looked really nice were just completely hidden, and I just couldn't see this going in someone's home. So I painted the legs and just put that at the back of my mind. I was going to let it dry just a little bit so I could just scrape it all back off, but I just put it in the back of my mind for now and just go ahead and start drilling all the holes to attach this to the table. And because this is a coffee table and you're not gonna take it apart to move it, it's gonna fit through doors and everything, I decided I'm just gonna glue it straight onto glue it and screw it straight onto the table instead of using threaded inserts and stuff. There's already threaded inserts in the table, but they match up dead weirdly now because obviously we've cut down the table and we moved it and everything. So just decided just to glue it on, and there's not going to be a lot of wood movement. In my mind, it's going to be fine anyway. So I just went ahead, poured a bunch of glue in there, stuck it on, screwed everything down so it's all nice and tight, and then I came back later on and filled up all the holes. And after I've glued everything, I always go around with a wet rag just to get up all the excess. It makes it a lot more easier when it comes to sanding. And talking about sanding, that's what I'm doing now. Just doing the final sanding, getting it all nice up, getting rid of the old finish. And this has been a new thing to me. I actually saw it in one of my comments in my old videos. Can't remember who the guy's name was, but I really, really like using this now. It is actually clothing dye. I just went to the range, I think it was, and I picked up brown clothing dye, and I used it on this table, and it looked really, really, really nice. I was a bit panicked at first, because when I first put it on, it looked really, really nice, and then I left it to dry, and it looked pink, and I was really worried that I just ruined the table. But turns out when you come back over it with your finish, like, you know, if you're using beeswax or some other sort of mineral oil, or, you know, a lacquer or something, it goes back to being brown. So yeah, I really recommend you using clothing dye. It's a lot cheaper as well if you're looking for cheap finishes. And there's me gassing myself out with spray paint fumes. But yeah, here's the gloss I used. I've got this in the link down in the description as well, but I actually don't really use this finish anymore. I use a different sort of finish. It's very expensive for what it actually is, and usually in a lot of lacquers, the brush marks sort of dissipate and smoothen out. For some reason on this finish, it just doesn't do that, and you get left with all the brush marks. So I'm using this here in this project, but I actually sanded this off and put another lacquer on, which turned out a lot more nicer as well. So yeah. And one of the mistakes I did make is after applying this lacquer and seeing all the brush marks in it, I went back to go and sand it all, and broke through some of it. So I had to do this process a couple of times, going back and forth sanding it, you know, redoing it. This was when I actually bought the new stuff. And right now I'm very concerned about these lighter spots, but it turns out once you go back over them with lacquer, it just clears out. I think it's just bubbles or a rough surface. I'm not sure what it actually is, because it wouldn't rub off when I touch it or anything, and I couldn't really sand it out. But when I poured lacquer back over it, it just disappeared. So if you know what it is, down in the comments, let me know. But this is me sanding it, trying to get all the brush strokes out, and you can see where I broke through on a lot of it, where the dye was there. So went back, completely resanded everything back down, re-dyed it. I mean, I actually did this a couple of times. I think I only showed it the once, but I did it like 3 times trying to get this finish to work. But I just kept sanding through the lacquer, and I was using like 400 grit. So yeah, I should have just built up the layers, but you know, hindsight's 2020, isn't it? I'm just using a dry rag right now to try and get it to dry a lot quicker, so I could get a lot more dye in there to make it even more brown. But you can see this is looking a lot nicer than the ebony finish that I used last time with the wood sheen. And this is a different lacquer that I bought from Poundland. I thought I might as well give it a try, but you know, there's a reason you don't use finishes in Poundland, and a lot of it just turned white, and I was horrified when I saw this, and obviously had to sand it and refinish it all and do all that. But I just moved on and started doing the legs instead, because I couldn't be even bothered at this point. I was just like, let's just hurry up and get this table done. So quickly finished painting the legs and everything, put the lacquer and the actual tabletop in the back of my mind, and tried figuring out what I was going to do while this dries. And then I went and spent some money on a reputable brand of lacquer. The only thing about this lacquer is I think it's an oil base or something, because it takes forever to dry. And so I literally built up the layers over a week. Every time I'd come back in from work, I'd just put another layer on it, and then at the end of the week I sanded everything down, and that seemed to do the trick. And yeah, the only thing is though, when I sanded this down, it didn't keep its gloss. So I went back over with a bit of beeswax after I sanded everything down, just to give it that glossy look back. And here's the finished table. I think it came out looking really, really nice. I love the rustic feel of it, with especially with the epoxy and the black cracks. It is a little bit patchy because I had to sand it down and re-dye it a few times, and other parts soaked up more than the others. But overall, I think it's nice from the wood we started from. So I hope you like this video. I hope you stick around, and I hope to see you soon.